Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ualde, President of the Navarre Parliament, representatives of the political parties, and the people and representatives of the trade unions and other social partners and friends. Good afternoon. And also good afternoon to all of you who are following this session from home. Welcome to the opening of this sixth and last social forum today on the 17th of March in the planetarium of Iruña, Pamplona. A social forum that will focus on taking stock and sharing the lessons that we've learned over 10 years of hard work, a collective journey involving many different stakeholders, including social, political, trade union, institutional, academic, and international players. But we would especially like to acknowledge all the victims for their contribution throughout this process. Without them, without their testimonies, many of which were indeed heard before the Parliament, and without their commitment to the construction of peaceful democratic coexistence, the headway that makes us better off today than we were 10 years ago would not have been possible. And we have with us Néstor Salaberry, who will be accompanying on the cello the reading of some testimonies. Testimonies shared with us by some victims over the years. Aitzibe and Aritz Arozkoa will be reading the testimonies. I was just 16 back then. They called me on the telephone and they told me that my brother had been wounded. By the time we arrived, he'd already died. And all that time, my only feeling was that this couldn't be happening. I just simply couldn't accept it. We resigned. It had a terrible feeling of impotence. The person who killed my father hasn't been tried, hasn't been condemned. And this generates a sensation, a feeling of incredulity, of impotence, of mistrust in a system with which we have no choice but to live. Fear of physical and psychological pain, fear of myself, fear of the people around me. For me, it was very painful to go into my car every day and have to turn on the engine and to listen to that click. I had panic attacks. We were completely threatened all the time. We felt threatened, and we needed bodyguards at one point. On the same day that we held my father's funeral, we received telephone threats, and that's how we lived for 8 years. And all our complaints were simply ignored. I've had to learn to live with what happened to me. I've had to learn that I'm afraid of the dark. I have to turn the light on at night. I've understood now why I don't like to dive. I understand now why I feel the size that I feel. I now understand why I don't like people covering my eyes. You feel really nervous every time a family member doesn't come home. You wait. Will they be with their friends? Will they have been arrested? Will they have been disappeared? Is he dead? I started to feel the need to understand what had happened to other people. We were just told that we were collateral damage, but we weren't. We were humans, human beings, some of us children, and the bomb cut short our life. They simply refused to acknowledge that our brother was there, and then the official version arrived, and they said, stop searching for him. I've lived on parole for 12 years. My daughter had a terrible time of it. I've stopped seeing my family so I don't put them in danger. The official version is that he died of natural causes, that it was a heart attack, and therefore the door was shut on any form of justice. I found it really, really difficult to understand that other people had suffered as well, because that meant that I had to adopt a position. I tried not to let hate eat me alive. I said to myself, I don't hate. I tried to rationalize everything I was going through. I wouldn't wish this on anyone. Hearing the pain that other victims have gone through, regardless of who or did what to me or why they did it to me, has really broken something inside me, and I now feel their pain as my own. Getting closer to other victims has helped me understand that the world isn't black and white. There are many shades of grey. The truth is multifaceted, and this is something that we all need to accept. It's not easy to sit down and talk to each other, but it will never get any easier if we don't do it. We all have to live together looking towards the future. I have chosen to build bridges.
Construir puentes.
The Permanent Social Forum was presented to society in October 2016 in Ayete, on the 5th anniversary of the International Conference. In January 2016, the third Social Forum was held on the disarmament of ETA. And then we began a process of reflection that took place in Guernica, facilitated by conciliation resources. This led to the establishment of the Permanent Social Forum and the first peace forum organized by Lokarri and Bakebidea, and the organizations and groups that participate in the two social forums. The state of the process back in 2016 wasn't very good. The obstructionist attitude maintained by the Spanish state over the years continued. Internal documents were leaked, and there were incidents of eavesdropping, persecution. International actors and stakeholders had to testify before the National High Court and at the Bayona police station, and we had to endure many other pressures. But today, I think we congratulate ourselves on having overcome many of these difficulties and on having managed to build a trust that has helped us to weave networks and new alliances and to get where we are today. Furthermore, many trade unions and social partners have now included these very issues on their agenda. Bridges have been built. Bridges that have opened up doors here in the Basque Autonomous Community, in Catalonia and in Madrid that would have been unthinkable some years back. And during all these years, the principal aim of the Social Forum has been to build trust, using the methodology of the middle lane, which basically means avoiding partisan positions. Thus, all the organizations that make up the Permanent Social Forum, in total 17, in all their diversity, have participated right until the end of the forum, and we have been able to build an extensive network of alliances. Now, we know that it takes a great deal of patience and a lot of listening to build and maintain an agreement. We have to be very careful with the way we weave together all these different relationships. And here too, I think that we can look back with pride on what we've managed to achieve, because to some extent the Social Forum has made it possible to build a new political culture for dealing with inequalities. And here we've learned a lot here in Navarre. In this sense, in order to learn about the progress, the difficulties and the challenges that have risen in Navarre in the construction of peaceful democratic coexistence, we will now give way to a dialogue between H.P. Iriarte and Fernando Armendariz, moderated by Fernando Rey. So, Fernando, whenever you're ready, the floor is all yours.
Buenas tardes. ¿Se escucha bien?
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me all right. Good afternoon, everyone. Arratsaldeon, as we say in the Basque language. So as you know, the Permanent Social Forum is a facilitating space that is made up of different organizations from the civil society and different individuals. Its aim is to try to push forward the Basque peace process and to help overcome the deadlock. And over the last few days, I've been thinking about something that the writer Cristina Rivera once said. She once said, "I believe in the power of the word, and that talking about things in a different way helps us to change the conditions of our lives." And I think that's been, in fact, been one of the purposes, one of the tasks of the forum. And in Navarre, the process has had some idiosyncrasies, and this is what we're here to talk about today. Two people who have been involved in this process. There's many different associations and organizations have been involved, but we have two people from two of them here today. And we're going to be looking at the peculiarities of the process here in Navarre, the specificities of the process here in Navarre, and how two people who have worked in it very, very hard see it, which is why we have Fernando Armendariz, who is a lecturer in human rights and international current affairs. And he himself says, he defines himself as basically a human rights activist. When I said to him, "How do you want me to introduce you?" He said, "Introduce me as a human rights activist." So he has worked in a number of different organizations, Amnesty International, Gesto por la Paz, El Carri, Lo Carri, and currently in the Permanent Social Forum. We also have Ejpe Iriarte. She is a retired teacher. She has worked in three main fields: in the promotion and normalization of the Basque language, particularly in Sortzen. She's also worked in the political field as a local councillor and a member of Udalbiltza, the Association of Local Councils, working to defend civil and political rights. And also she's worked in the field of peace building in the Permanent Social Forum in Navarra. I'm now going to repeat the introduction. I just said it before in Basque, and I'm now repeating it in Spanish. So he's just repeating that she is a retired teacher and has worked in three different areas. So we're going to be having a chat with these two people. We know that there is a simultaneous interpreting service. So if you would like to speak in Spanish, please speak in Spanish. If you'd like to speak in Basque, please speak in Basque. If you want to speak in English, you can also speak in English. Now, I know that we're running a little bit late, and I'm sure someone's going to start making desperate gestures to me before too long. So we're just going to try and wrap this up in a half an hour, because this is the time that we have been given. But let me just ask you, first of all, a fairly personal question. What is it that prompted both of you to get involved in this particular field? Well, I'll start, if that's okay. As you said, from the very moment that I started to work, first of all, as a teacher, right from the beginning, I saw how difficult it was to learn and study in Basque in Navarre. Learning and working in Basque is one of our basic rights. So this is where I first started focusing my efforts to try to promote the different opportunities which existed to study in Basque. And I worked in the local council in Pamplona, so I started to work in the official political world. And I saw the other difficulties involved, and this is when I started to work to defend human rights in general, not just language rights. So here I'm talking about political rights, civil rights, and this has been the main focus of my activities. And when the Social Forum was established in Navarre, I was asked to join, if I would be willing to join. And I said yes, because I thought it would be something very exciting, very important. There was a lot of work that I believed needed to be done. It's hard work, and now we're here at the end of the process, and that's fantastic. So, what about you, Fernando? What was it that prompted you to get involved? Well, I think it was just a natural continuation of all my previous commitments in the field of human rights, in the field of peace building, in searching to establish peaceful coexistence, and everything that I'd done elsewhere. I was invited. Well, a good friend of mine who's sitting there, Gabe, was there, and he and Agus also asked me to join. And I said, okay, I'll just help you until you start, you get going and you find your feet. That was my initial answer. And I'm delighted to be here right at the end of it. It's 10 years later, you're still here, right? Yes, 10 years later, and I'm still here. Now, the first thing I wanted to ask you, as you remember, the work of the forum began with 13 recommendations back in 2013. Now, do you think, what was the most urgent need in Navarre? I mean, what was special about the situation in Navarre? What was special about the work what needed to be done specifically in Navarre? What was particularly necessary here in Navarre, right back at the beginning?
No,
No te calles.
Yo creo que Navarra compartía.
Well, I think that Navarre, just like the rest of the Basque Country and Spain in general at that time, Navarre shared many of the concerns and needs related to peaceful coexistence and peace. The difference was that we needed to specify it here. And this, we had to say very specifically that we wanted to walk down the same road. It wasn't a different road. But in Navarre, there was a different way of working. So I think that if there was something special about what happened in Navarre, well, you're all here, right? All the different political parties here, all the representatives are here. There are parties that also have sister parties in the Basque Autonomous Community, but here in Navarre is a different way of working, I believe. And I think we were right to try to strengthen this particular type of working. I think we have reached consensus here that they weren't able to reach in the autonomous community of the Basque Country. And it seems that, some people even said, it seems that things work differently in Navarre, right? And yes, that's true. But the fundamental elements, the principles and the aim and the objective, they were all shared at the end of the day. Well, I should think I could say that here in Navarre, I don't think there was a different set of priorities. If we're talking about these 13 recommendations, they were all very important recommendations. They were recommendations that we needed to follow in order to build a culture of peace and to achieve peaceful coexistence in the future. But when we started to work here in the Navarre group, there were, I think, some very special moments. And they coincided with the different terms of office, because they were fairly special as well. They were a bit different, these different terms of office. And we were in a term of office, and we believed that we had to, which opened a lot of doors, opened a lot of possibilities for us. And then in the next term of office, and then in the current term, they're very different with the very first one. Back then, the very first one where we started to work. But we have managed to continue to develop thanks to the work that was actually carried out during that very first term of office, which was a very special one because of the political situation. And I think it's no coincidence that that initial initiative of the social forum, the very first meeting, was actually held in Navarre. I think it was on the 4th of November in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, in the Navarre Parliament. And it was a very special event. And we actually held it in the Parliament building, in the actual chamber. And that was really important because it showed how important we were taking it and how important this change in the term of office was, the change that was happening in the political situation because all sorts of different victims who got together to listen to each other, people looking at each other with respect, victims of different types. And at that time, the Navarre Social Forum, I think, really laid the groundwork for what was going to be its actions over the coming years. It really laid the groundwork for the work that it was going to carry out. And that was to bring people together, to talk to each other, to listen to each other. This was a tool that we thought was very, very important. And we needed to create spaces to talk, to have a dialogue with each other. And I remember that moment because it was the moment in which we defined our working style. And it was a working style that was adapted to our specific region. We didn't import it from anywhere, so that was an important starting point, right? But sometimes it seems a bit contradictory because some people said that in Navarre there was more of a stalemate, there was much more conflict between different ideologies, especially around language. But in fact, you've managed to overcome that, right? You have now a very open space in which different types of victims come together, all working together to defend the human rights of each and every individual on this planet. Yes, I think that's just been one of the major successes of the forum. I think that's one of the main things that we've achieved. The fact that we can sit down with people who think differently from us, look each other in the eyes and listen to each other. So it's a meeting of eyes and a meeting of ears. And also a meeting of hearts. Because we've been trying to put ourselves in other people's shoes. I mean, you don't forget your own ideology, your own ideas, your political convictions. You don't forget that. But you are able to focus on what is important. You don't forget who you are, but that doesn't stop you from listening to the other person, to share in their suffering. I don't know if that's called consensus. I don't know if we can call it that, but it is, I think, a consensus. But it's an effective type of consensus. It's an emotional consensus. And I'm very grateful to the forum because it has taught me how to reach an emotional consensus with people with whom before I wouldn't have sat down at the same table with. And in the political field, we have achieved unimaginable consensuses. They would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. And we have convinced people to trust us, and we've trusted other people, even though we think very differently. Because here, we love labeling people. So you label someone, and that's it. There you go. That's all you have to do. And it was difficult to actually hang a label on the forum because it was a very plural group of people. I'm just looking out in the audience, and there are so many different people from all walks of life and all political ideologies. It was a very plural group. And because of that plurality, we've managed to reach important consensus, and that's enabled us to make the headway that we've made. And this is in different way of thinking about people, different ways of looking at the world. It is difficult to do that, but we've managed to achieve that. And it's the success of the forum, but it's also the success of all of those who have accompanied us in all of our work. Would you like to say something? Would you like to add anything? Yes, well, in my case, at perhaps a more personal level, I would say that I've learnt so much during this process. I'm a better person now than I was when I started. I really feel that I've learnt a lot and that it has transformed me. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the people in the group who are here today, because the empathy that I have felt in all the senses has been tremendous. And as you were saying earlier, it is true that there was perhaps the positions were there was a much greater degree of confrontation here between ideologies, and perhaps because of that, there were, I don't know, a better way of finding a consensus. But it was a very complex situation. I do think that a lot has been achieved. So if we could have, take the metaphor of a game of chess, the white pieces had a very, very important advantage, and the black pieces were not in such a good position. They were just on the defensive. But in fact, that game of chess, I really believe, will now end in a stalemate, much more than I think the possibility, the likelihood of that is much greater than it was 10 years ago. And that's the idea of the forum, that there should be no winners and no losers. This is what we want. We don't want any winners. We don't want any losers. I have a question for both of you. In your opinion, how has the situation improved? So, where have we made headway? Thanks to the contribution of the forum and to all the different stakeholders who have been working. So what are the main things that we've achieved? What should we feel proud of? What should we feel satisfied with? I mean, let's not be self-complacent about this, but, we need to celebrate our successes. So, what achievements are you most proud of? Because they were hard, perhaps, or because they were important? Well, I have this very clear in my mind. The disarmament. That was the most important thing, especially for someone who has lived all their life with the presence of an armed struggle and who felt the harm and the pain that this has caused. The disarmament was a really important achievement. We've also seen and witnessed and felt the suffering that was caused by the state in retaliation to the presence of ETA. In Bayonne, I remember I was asked, what are you going to call the declaration in Spanish? Or when I was invited to see the statement in Bayonne, that was one of the most important moments of my life. And I think there's been a lot of headway made in prison policy. People who have had access to a freer regime in prison, those who have been brought closer to their homes. Every time we achieved something in this sense, that's an important step forward. But I think there's one achievement that you can't qualify, you can't score on a scorecard, for example, and that is that experience by everyone, all the individuals who have together been working towards the building of a future that's different for future generations. Future generations, they don't have to forget what has happened, but they're very far from it. And I think that mentally they're at a great distance from what happened, and that's really important. And being able to share all of that, both here and on the other side of the Spanish-French border, thanks to people like Anaï, who is sitting there, some of the artisans of peace, some of them who are no longer with us. All of that experience has been a major achievement. They've been the most special moments that I have experienced.
Well, I believe there are many reasons why we should feel proud. We have been working a great deal, much headway has been made. And I believe that in this day to day, well, sometimes you feel frustrated, you believe it's really hard, very difficult, you want to give up, but with time, in hindsight, I believe we have made huge progress. Well, we have accomplished a great deal. And honestly, I believe that we should be very proud of the way we have worked. It has been highly innovative. It has been unique. And I believe that we need to feel very proud about it. We also need to acknowledge and recognize what we do, the annual appearance in Parliament. In total, 22 presentations in Parliament, 22 round tables, 22 initiatives, events with victims. It was very moving. And I'd like to mention something that is very moving as well. For me, personally, and when I think about it, I get goosebumps. It was very, very moving when I saw those 6 tortured women in the Parliament of Navarre, people in silence, listening to these victims, listening to these women who were, well, describing what they had endured. And they were very, very brave when explaining what they had endured. And when listening to them, I thought, now we've made it. This injustice, this torture has been brought to the light. It's no longer in the dark. And I saw those women in the parliament in Navarre, not just them, not just those victims, also men that had been tortured. And I thought, we've made it. We started to secure change. We started to put an end to injustice. I found that experience myself very, very moving. When we have organized victims encounters, those experiences as well have been extremely, extremely moving. Their generosity when it came to listening to other victims, when it came to acknowledging their pain, the pain of others, and doing that exercise in public with such humility. And I think we have made significant progress. We need to feel very proud of these major achievements. We've also tabled many reports on torture, on many different subject matters. And honestly, we need to feel extremely proud. And if I may, I'd like to mention as well those events that we have organized in which we have summoned people from very different ideological positions. Those are also significant milestones. We've been able to bring together people, with different ideologies so that they would engage in an open dialogue. This was something unthinkable many years ago, not even in our dreams, and we made it happen. And I'd also like to underscore the latest experience, the last experience during which during 9 months, people with different backgrounds, with very different experiences, have engaged in a conversation, and people with sometimes views that were clashing. And at the beginning, when these people met, these were in-camera sessions, and people felt very comfortable, freed, and in the end, we made those encounters public, and these people went to Parliament to share the outcomes of those conversations. And this is something that would have been hard to believe some years ago. Yes, I completely agree with you. Well, I think we need to acknowledge that now we are at a point in which the forum will close its doors. We are reaching an end. Perhaps our task is about to finish, but this, in my opinion, is a task that will never end, that will be given continuity to. It's true that the forum comes to an end because it has met its goals, its objectives, but what's on the punch list? What needs to be done? And who needs to take on the baton now? Perhaps we need to make a call now for other stakeholders to take a lead. What kind of organizations, the public administrations, who needs to step in at this moment in time? Well, the forum has made a very positive contribution, but we cannot be self-complacent. We cannot believe that, we've solved all the issues, that there are no problems out there, that there's no injustice. No. There are some people out there who haven't had the right to truth, the right to justice, and this is something that we need to acknowledge. Yes, we need to understand that we are proud and satisfied because we have, met or been able to implement many of the recommendations that stemmed from the initial forum. Out of those 12 recommendations, many of these recommendations have been met. And the truth is that we're better off now, much better off than 10 years ago. There's still much to be done. Uh, it's true that now we can boast about what we have done. Much has been achieved, but we cannot be over complacent. What remains to be done? I believe that there's still a long, winding road ahead. There's much to be done to contribute to peaceful coexistence, inclusive memory, a multifaceted memory, as we have tried to reflect in our recommendations. We need to build memory that is inclusive, and we consider that it is our responsibility to contribute to a peaceful coexistence. We need to articulate conflicts in a different manner, in a different fashion. And it's very important that we see our rivals not as enemies that need to be defeated. And I'm sure that there are organizations out there. There are already some organizations that are trying to put an end to the special prison policy. Some victims haven't been duly recognized. It's true that much headway has been done for the state victims. However, there's still a need for society to overcome, and we will see this soon with the upcoming elections, but we need to overcome that confrontation, the aggressiveness that sometimes exists in times of elections. Everybody needs to be free to speak up, to convey what they want for Navarre and for the world. They need to feel free to speak in friendly terms, avoiding threats, avoiding lies, avoiding insults, and lies are lies in French and English and Basque and Swahili. And this seems to be a political virtue. And this is not the case, not at all. Quevedo of hypocrisy said that it's a non-moral sin. And it's a virtue of politics. And I would love society to react positively in order to condemn and punish those attitudes and acknowledge and pay tribute to other more constructive attitudes, and not just in politics, also in the world of sports. We see this in sports, the soccer world. A better life is a life in which we can all coexist peacefully with people that think differently to us. A better life is a life where we live together with foreigners, with people that think differently, but all together we can build a better future, a brighter future for each and every one of us. And then the space of victims is also very important. We need to listen to victims, not just because it's a matter of justice, and of course it is, but because we need to learn from them. Espe was referring to those hearings in the parliament. What an enriching experience. We learned a great deal. These encounters were very positive and helped us understand the task at hand, what had to be done. Regarding memory, we need to build many different memories. And while many people will no longer remember this, but I remember that there was a time that was much harder here. And back then, we followed some paths that shouldn't have been followed. Yes, I believe that what you're saying is true. We're closing the doors to this forum, but much remains to be done for peace, for peaceful coexistence. There's still much to be done. Who needs to play a leading role? Well, I believe that many of the people here in the room will continue working just as they have been up until now. Society needs to set the pace, needs to define the priorities. We will have to look for the tools that will help us in our endeavor. And what we have done, if I may say, is hodgepodge. And we've done brainstorming exercise. We've tried to help society. I believe that we're running a bit late, but I'd like to mention one last example. Earlier, I was mentioning this group of women that had suffered torture, and I'd like to share a specific example. Recently, in the Parliament of Navarre, a report was tabled, a report by the EBAC, that included testimonies of 1,065 victims, and most of the trade unions and political parties considered that this report was necessary and have recognized the importance of this report, and they have acknowledged that we have opened up a new path. We're talking about 44 municipalities in total that have supported the resolution that has been presented. So I believe that much remains to be done, but much has been accomplished already. Who will do this? Well, society, with the support of the different institutions, of the different stakeholders that need to be engaged necessarily, that need to give a helping hand, that need to collaborate. And when the society is organized, well, I'm sure that we will continue making headway. And I'd like to finish up with some words of acknowledgement to Expert, to Fernando. Thanks for sharing with us your insights, your personal experiences. Thanks for your generosity. And since we're here in Navarre, I'd like to highlight that the environment has changed. We see a different working environment, and I believe that we've been able to leave aside that confrontation. We've been able to avoid those clashes, that mistrust, and now situation is much better off. And I'd like to thank everyone here in the room from different political parties, because you have weaved personal ties, and thanks to those ties that you have built, we've all been able to progress in the defense of human rights and towards peaceful coexistence and peace. I encourage you to continue working hard, and after Elections Day, I hope that you do everything you can to continue defending the human rights of each and every individual, and please raise the flag of human rights, of peace and peaceful coexistence in Navarre. And now we're going to continue with the next session. We're going to be listening to other panelists. We're going to wrap up this roundtable and open the next. Thanks very much for your attention. I believe that it's working well, that it's wonderful that we're able to engage in this conversation in different languages. And I'd like to, well, thank the interpreters for their work.
Aurrera jarraituko dugu bada. Antes mencionaba
Earlier, I was mentioning that this has been a collective journey. Expe and Fernando have underscored this as well. But aside from the social, political, and trade union stakeholders, the peace building process has been accompanied by the international community. Many of you may recall the role played by the International Contact Group or the Verification Committee, but other international bodies have also closely monitored this process and have provided advice for many of the major milestones of our history. I'm talking about the Berhoff Foundation and Conciliation Resources, among others. And here, today, we enjoy the presence of two people that have helped us along this journey. I'd like to invite to the stage Veronique Dudet and Christian Erbolsheimer, and the chair of this session, Teresa Toda. We will be able to learn about the international contribution and the participation of the Basque civil society, a participation that has rendered the peace-building process into a very unique phenomenon. And you'll understand why I'm saying this in a minute. Thanks very much to our dear panelists. You have the floor. Thanks very much, ladies, gentlemen. Thanks, Christian. Thanks, Veronique. Thanks to our panelists. And I'd like to thank the organizers. I feel very lucky to be sitting here in front of all of you. We are living a process that is very unique, very special, that has engaged many different stakeholders and collaborators here and internationally. And I'd like to thank most sincerely our panelists for their contribution to this process. During the past years, we've learned to know them better because our dear colleagues have participated in many of the events that we have organized, but they've also been working hard behind the scenes. And today, we're going to look back in time, and they're going to share with us their experiences, their thoughts, their insights, looking out to a future that will be brighter thanks to their contributions. They will talk from the standpoint of the organizations they work in and also from their personal standpoint. Our two guests have a broad experience in conflict resolution processes. Veronique Duduet, I'll start off by her. I'll introduce her first, is one of the experts that has participated in conflict resolution. She works for the Berghoff Foundation since the year 2005, where she has researched in the field of resistance movements, negotiation, intervention of third parties, and asymmetrical conflict. She also provides advice to different civil society organizations. And I'd also like to say that she has been engaged in many peace processes, and she provides advice in different countries. And Christian, for example, comes from the Catalan Institute for Peace, where he has been working since 2018. Christian has been involved in peace processes in different countries. He has authored 3 books and participated in many projects, research projects in the field of conflict transformation. Holds a master's from the UK, master's in international relations and security. So I was saying Christian, repeating again, comes from the Catalan Institute for Peace. He chairs this international institute. He holds a degree in agricultural engineering, and he has a master's in the culture of peace by the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona, and he also holds a master's degree from an American university. He is an analyst of peace processes, and he studies the role of the civil society in transition processes. He has also provided his support to peace processes in the Philippines and the Basque Country and in Colombia. He also worked in Reconciliation Resources, an organization that was very much engaged in this process, and he was the program head in the so-called Peace Culture School of the UAB. Now we're going to, kickstart the conversation. This dialogue will be engaged in English so that our panelists can express themselves more comfortably.
Begin. I would like to ask you in the first place, what was your organization's view on the Basque situation before it became involved in our peace process? And what were your own personal views or knowledge of what was happening here?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry to be speaking in Spanish. Oh, sorry, in English. Right. I hope you all have the interpretation device. So before we became engaged in supporting the Basque peace process, I knew very little about it because Bargov, as an organization, we work in other parts of the world, but very little in Europe, and especially not in Western Europe. I only knew what I saw from the media, so especially the big marches of the peace movement, the marches of the pro-independence movement. I had a friend who was doing his PhD on the peace movement, so that's kind of what I knew about it. And then we became invited to be part of it, but maybe before going into that, maybe you want to say about how you...
Sure. In our situation, thank you also, Teresa, and Agus and everybody else for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Feels a little bit strange to speak in English, but that's fine. So two different perspectives. Conciliation Resources, the organization I was working for, is an organization supporting peace processes in many parts of the world. Probably most of the conflicts we work on are self-determination conflicts, and all of them who have been going on for many, many years. Kashmir between India and Pakistan, Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and of course, at the very beginning, Northern Ireland, which was closer to home. So the case of Basque Country as a geographic context was very distant. However, the need to talk and to address a self-determination conflict in a constructive way through the role of civil society organizations and victims, that was more familiar. Personally, the fact that I am a Catalan, I was working for a London-based international peacebuilding organization on Colombia and the Philippines, made it easier and made me the main link between my organization and whatever support we could provide here in the Basque Country.
Go on, Veronique, you were going to add something?
No, maybe about why we then became engaged, right?
That would be the next question,
Right.
how and why you became involved as organizations, and well, personally, Christian has already said something.
Yes. I was one of the projects that I was involved in at Bargov was a process of participatory research with former leaders of armed movements who had gone through successful peace processes, and we were gathering lessons from those transitions. And we were invited by members of the Abed Saleh left in the Basque Country who wanted to understand themselves, their own past peace processes, so they wanted to conduct a similar exercise of critical self-reflection. And we were also invited by the newspaper Gaha to come in Donostia to present the results of that research and to bring some veterans from South Africa, from Northern Ireland, to share those experiences in order to maybe inspire and elicit a similar process of self-reflection.
That's very, very interesting. And then I know this is sensitive and discrete terrain, but could you give us some details on the first contacts and steps taken really to engage in what was going to happen? and was it difficult to define an approach to the matter, to the Basque question, within your organizations? As you say, this was sort of, even though it was very close physically, but it was not one of your main preoccupations, the Basque situation.
We didn't have at Conciliation Resources any political problem. Actually, we had already a line of research and action challenging the idea of putting organizations and people in a list of proscribed organizations in the European Union. As peace builders, we know very well the importance to talk to absolutely everybody, and that these lists actually made the work of peace builders much more difficult. So from that perspective, it was not a problem at all. The problem was more of if we wanted to play a more active role, getting funding to do that. We are an NGO, we depend on funds, and it was very difficult whenever we tried to raise some funds to make a more sustained support. We didn't manage to get there. However, at the end of the day, got invited first by Paul and later by Agus, and of course the organizations and everybody else working with him. I remember a forum 10 years ago here in this city. We were sitting together joining a panel, and so whenever we got an invitation, when anybody thought we could bring in whatever something useful, we would be very glad to accept those invitations, as we are today.
For us, it was a matter of maybe deciding whether we wanted to play a more discrete role of strategic and technical support to the various agents in that process, or whether we wanted to take more of a public role. And I think we decided to do a combination of both. So public appearances on topics where we really have something to contribute. So for instance, even before Ayete, I remember coming to the northern Basque country when there was the case of Aurore Martin, to talk about the experience of how counterterrorism is really affecting conflict resolution and the need to change gears and to have a different approach. So when I felt that's something that I had been conducting research on, I had something to say, I could speak publicly. And I think in that role we also then became invited by Locari to be involved in co-hosting or being part of the organizers of the Ayete conference. And in a more discrete role, I would say, for instance, with initiators later of the social forum, we had some technical capacity building activities with Bakebidea, for instance, and with Locari to help them think about what does it mean for society, for citizens to contribute to a peace process? What are methodologies that we can learn from other places in for instance, how to organize a national dialogue? And I think those ideas were planting seeds to what later became the social forum.
Yes, this is all really very, very interesting. And now I would like to go back to what Christian has said 10 years ago. Let's go back to then and see that ETA has put an end to his actions. There are no known contacts with either the Spanish or the French governments. The process seems to be in a total stalemate. But the first social forum takes place and puts forward a series of recommendations to try and move forward, a sort of roadmap for the process. As you have said, there was participation from your organizations, but how did you feel about this sort of blockage there was? There was a wall with the Spanish government, the French government, especially the Spanish government, of course, and there was absolutely no response. What can you do then?
I was very impressed by the sense of responsibility of people who formed then the first social forum, thinking that we cannot wait. We cannot wait forever. We cannot wait for the states to take action. We cannot wait even for our own political leaders, for the Basque authorities, for the armed movements to take action. We have to take the matter into our own hands. There's been a lot of talk about spaces for consultation, for consulting civil society. I think what happened here was not this kind of top-down, let's call on people from society and hear what they want to say, but it was from the bottom up. We want to be protagonists of that process. We have ideas. We want to hear experts bringing their own ideas, and we want to hear our own people, and then we want to make concrete proposals on very concrete issues that we think, even if these are very sensitive issues, security issues like weapons, like victims, well, we can't let those in the hands of just a few people. We want to play a role, and so that's what motivated me to be part of supporting those processes.
We have experienced, like you have experienced here, building peace, building bridges can be a very frustrating endeavor, because sometimes, or most of the times, the circumstances make it very difficult to see what else can we do. And the current big conflict where nobody has an answer is Ukraine. How do you build peace in Ukraine? In a way, you get this in most of the conflicts, and you had that situation 10 years ago. Under those circumstances, there is always windows of opportunity. You don't sit and wait for them to come. You have to create the conditions for them to open, to come and to be able. And what you had in this context is a number of people and organizations and movements who had the commitment, as Veronique just said, the responsibility, but also the creativity and the ability to work for those conditions even when they were not there. At the end of the day, this became an opportunity, because this made the process much more democratic than if it had been managed only by the peace negotiators and in secret meetings in distant places.
Which is something that had failed in the first processes that took place here in the Basque Country, right? We know how they all came apart. Then in 2016, the Social Forum strengthens itself by setting up the Permanent Social Forum. Little by little, things began moving slowly, very slowly and cautiously, but the bigger picture remained quite static. At that time, I don't know if your participation was as close as it had been in previous years, and how did you view all these developments? Very slowly, but very weak responses from, let's say, the other side. And issues like victims or the prisoners were still terribly difficult to approach. I'm talking about 2016, 2020.
So we were both privileged to be actually invited to support what then became the Permanent Social Forum, and I was also there when it was publicly announced. What I found interesting about that moment was to help many of you who are in this room, who were the initiators of that Permanent Social Forum, to think together of what kind of space do we want, what are the bridges that we want to build, as has been said before, what are the challenges ahead, so how can we be a plural entity, making sure also that we are autonomous from political actors, having legitimacy, avoiding the critiques that we'll be receiving, trying to anticipate those critiques, and taking stock of the previous years, and then how to go ahead, especially around the question of disarmament, which I think was, the most immediate question at the time. And so we also helped the Permanent Social Forum to publish a study when the disarmament happened in 2017, trying to take stock on how that had been done in a very unique and unconventional way, in what many have called it a unilateral way, but I think it's not unilateral. It was in this dialogue with the Basque society, right? And going through all of the ways through which international standards on disarmament and demobilization are supposed to be, and saying, well, actually, it fulfilled all of those requirements. So it was done in a secure way, in an inclusive way, in a transparent way. So trying to bring those lessons to people here, for them to recognize that we have done it according to international standards, and we should be proud of that, but also for others in other countries to start to learn about that experience, which I think later on then for me became more of the focus of thinking how what's been happening here can be of interest and of inspiration for other struggles in other countries.
I would add to that, and along the very similar line, there is no peace process in the world that has worked according to the expectations of the people who had suffered the conflict. There's no perfect peace process in the world. Even if you look at the case of Northern Ireland, a tiny territory inside the European Union, a peace agreement that is now soon 25 years old, which had the political and financial support from the European Union, which is very rare. The European Union does not work on conflicts internally, but the Northern Ireland was a big exception. Even under those circumstances today, there are huge challenges in Northern Ireland. And still, the Basque Country learned a lot from Northern Ireland, Colombia learned a lot from Northern Ireland, Philippines learned a lot from Northern Ireland. In the quest of building peace, we all try to learn of those who worked before us, but because you cannot copy and paste, eventually you end up innovating in your own context. And when you innovate in your own context, like Veronique said, you end up becoming the reference for the next peace process that will come somewhere else. So at the end of the day, it's very interesting and very nice that all peace processes in the world learn from the previous ones and teach to the next ones. And that's something we started feeling along those years when this was taking root in this new phase, because civil society initiatives in the Basque Country contributing to peace and confronting dialogue, confronting violence had been going on for many, many years, but in different political moments needed different social and political responses, and that was something exciting, new, that was being born.
Thank you very much for these reflections. Along those years, which would you say was the most dangerous moment before disarmament or when disarmament was being worked on? Would you have a feeling of one of those moments that was really crucial and was well solved in the end, before disarmament and just after? Because as we have said, disarmament took place within the general criteria of the UN's definition of DDR, but with its own distinctive traits, of course. And from then on, we saw the Spanish government taking some few and timid steps in penitentiary policy, which we could say was the most visible part at the time. And the question of victims started sort of veering to another point. But before all that, or while all that was happening, did you see a special and specific dangerous point where things could sort of go badly?
I mean, I think there's lots of moments probably where people were losing hope, thinking, okay, we've had the Ayete conference, we've made those commitments, there's been all these important people coming from the outside world to tell the Spanish state, now you have to also come to the table. And we keep pushing and coming up with new ideas, but nothing is moving. And so I think there could have been a lot of frustration and a sense of loss of hope. But I think there's been this readiness to realize that peace processes are not linear, right? And so sometimes it goes 2 steps forward, it goes 1 step back, and then 2 steps forward again. And so that obstacle, I think, was overcome. I think what could also have gone wrong was if, when finally ETA decided to self-decommission and dismantle itself, then that there would have been, again, no response, thinking this was our biggest leverage and we have let go of it, but now we really want to see some moves on issues around the prisoners, around like some of the most difficult consequences of the conflict. And so if there had been no move then following that, I think that would have been also a big moment of disillusionment. But as you've mentioned, there have been some slow progress happening in the treatment of prisoners. Some smaller challenges. One that I can remember was when there was a small disconnect, I would say, between maybe dynamics in the southern and in the North Basque Country because of the different pace that things were moving at, the fact that maybe on the French side there was a big political consensus. There was some quick moves on the issue of weapons, whereas here people were still thinking, how can we resolve that? And so I think, again, that was bridged very easily, but there could have been also a lot of tensions coming out of that. So, yeah, they've all been overcome.
Yes.
I would agree with her. I wouldn't add anything else, except that in the process overall of terminating ETA's violence and dismantling, there was, of course, the risk of splinter groups who would not agree with the decision, and that is normal. That happens almost always, everywhere in the world. And I think this was very carefully managed and very successfully managed.
Mm-hmm. So we have been already going into some of the other questions I had. Could you point out, in your view, which are the main strengths of the process that is still going on here, and its main weaknesses, if that's possible? I suppose so.
Well, on strength, I mean, we heard it in the table before. I think in this phase, Permanent Social Forum has built, of course, on the achievements of previous civil society organizations in the years and decades before, and it has managed a number of issues on top of what has been already mentioned. I think one thing that's fundamental, it's very difficult when you are living the conflict yourself, or the post-conflict, if you want, to think clearly. Looking back now, the purposes, the 12 points, and then how step by step the decisions to move forward, how they were taken, seem very logical and obvious. But it's not at all logical and obvious when you are facing confusion, conflict, even if it's only not verbal and political rather than violent, to have a clear idea of what to do. And once you have a clear of what to do, to communicate with others who think differently and bring them on board. And I think the Permanent Social Forum has done an amazing job in that sense. You look back and it looks like you had a perfect plan from day one until today, and you were ticking the boxes of everything we were achieving. And of course, that was not a linear process. But I think it was so well done that it looks like it was.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned already a number of those strengths around proactiveness, around a plurality of the space for dialogue and interlocution. I mean, the plurality that you present in this room today, from political parties to trade unions to associations, to former victims and well, to current victims and former prisoners and so forth. I think that's a huge achievement. The fact that also you have managed to separate these issues around the core roots of the conflict, the political issue, and the consequences of the conflict. I think that's been quite interesting because in most other processes, one wants to resolve first the political issues and then dealing with the consequences. And here, I think one of the many areas of innovation was thinking, well, maybe we can solve some of those consequences first. And then, when the question of violence is out of the equation, maybe then we can move to the political negotiations in a democratic space. And that's what's happening now. And so I think that's been something quite unique and really interesting. And I think that, yeah, I mean, as I've said before, what I've really learned from the Basque Country is that when society demands peace, it can be brought about in a dignified way, even in the absence of a negotiation with the state. And that's where the main weakness is, right? The fact that there has not been a formal conventional peace process, no agreement, means that there is no formal transitional justice process. And like we have seen in Northern Ireland and elsewhere, where it's been possible to, for instance, free up prisoners and to have truth commissions and so forth, this is difficult to establish because of that lack of a formal negotiated peace process. That's probably the main weakness.
Yes, that brings us up to now. Now, 2023, we have moved forward, as we both recognize. There has been great progress, not only in the processes themselves, but in Basque society itself. Its institutions, social agents, victims of the different sorts of violence, and prisoners as well. Prisoners have become engaged in these processes as well. But there are still some disturbing loose ends which require winding up to secure what has been achieved, such as would be questions related to prisoners and the fact that it's very difficult for them now to accede to parole because of the Audiencia Nacional's negative attitude, or the recognition, the effective recognition of victims of the different violences, and in particular torture. Which would be your recommendations for these new times and challenges? What should be done? How can we reach out to that state that we have never sat down with?
I think it's difficult right now to make any specific recommendations from outsiders like us who don't know the dynamics, the very specific dynamics that are going on right now. The concern has been there all the time that things could have been done differently and you had to advance with your one arm tied on your back. So that's nothing new. I think you are all quite used to this circumstance. Times are changing and are changing a lot, and somebody mentioned, and I can see actually in the room, there's hardly anybody from the age below 40 except for the presenter maybe. So there's of course a generational gap happening here, and that's not unique to the Basque Country, that's all of us working around the world. We need to be able to articulate a discourse that takes into consideration and brings in the new voices and new perspectives, and they can be very different. I was mentioning before, there's no, all peace processes learn and teach, but that the reality is also that the dynamics of armed conflict in the world are changing, and the way we do peace is changing as well. This idea of a state and an armed actor inside the state, and there's an armed conflict going on, we are about to see the last remains of that. With your case here, and the Colombian case in Peace Agreement 2016, and a few more going on. All other conflicts are different, so we have to relearn permanently also as peace-building organizations on how we work. And as ever, with new challenges also come new opportunities.
I think one thing is to look at the challenges ahead. Another thing is to celebrate what's been achieved. And I really like what you've tried to do 2 years ago with the Ayete after 10 years, and now trying to look back on those last 10 years, and so much has happened. What I find interesting is also in the title of this social forum, I'm seeing some shifts in the narratives. Before it was a lot about peace process, and now it's about peace building, because that's where you are. And now, like, this process is at a stage of building a sustainable peace, preventing future relapse or resumptions of violence, and building those bridges and this future together. And I think that has to be celebrated. I think I would really recommend that you continue working on all of those different fronts where you're working. So there's the political front and arena of dialogue and negotiation. There is the street front. I mean, what I've seen on the French side, the civil disobedience actions to try and push for change on prison conditions when dialogue is not possible. That's an important arena of continued struggle. There's also the legal sphere, the fact that all organizations of the Abed Saleh left have been decriminalized in Spain and in France, but there is still the EU terrorist legislation. A few months ago, we tried to bring a Basque senator to the US to speak at the UN headquarters about the transition from violence to peace and to politics, and that person did not get a visa or not on time. So these are continuing challenges that I think will have to be dealt with. And on the issues of building coexistence, recognizing all of the victims and their needs for compensation. I think the institutions will have to play their roles, and I guess that's what you have recognized by deciding to close this forum, by thinking, okay, we have done everything we can as civil society, but we also need now institutions to do their role. So I hope that's going to happen.
If I can add to that and what I said before, in the past we used to think that the peace process is a peace negotiation. And those who carry their weapons, they sit down around the table, they speak, and then eventually they sign an agreement, and then comes peace. And that doesn't work. Change in society needs peace negotiations and a peace agreement ideally, not necessarily, you have one without, but that's never enough. Change comes from people changing. And what we listened to in the panel before were people who shared with us today that their way of thinking about society and about people thinking differently from themselves a few years ago is very different from how they see it today. Building peace, I learned this from women from the Colombian Philippines who had an exchange program. They came up with their own definition of peace, which I found very interesting. You build peace when you are willing and able to step out of your comfort zone and reach out to those who think differently than you. Because if we all stay in our bubble of comfort and very convinced about our arguments, but never make the effort to try to understand why others think differently, doesn't matter if you have a piece of paper, a peace agreement or not. Change comes from this. And that, looking forward again and coming back to your question before as well, needs to multiply in society. You have experienced that with different groups of people coming together, with different experiences and suffering and trauma, and that needs, in as much as possible, to keep expanding, because only that way we can normalize a way of dealing with conflicts in our society, which we will keep having forever. There's always conflict in society, but in a constructive way. And that's the challenge of democracy. And democracy right now all over the world is facing some very difficult times, because we seem to have forgotten how to do things better.
Yes, and society itself is somehow becoming detached from some of these questions. As things sort of settle themselves down, people may think that the leaf has been turned and that's it. But as you say, you have to keep on going, and it's an ongoing process. That, I suppose, is a bit challenged, not only here, because everything has changed. Communications themselves, as you said, young people, it's not a problem only here. Young people have their own ways. How can we reach them? How could we reach them? That's the question. That's $1 billion question, maybe.
I don't know if we can give an answer to that or give it right now. But I do think there is I don't like recipes normally, and here I will come with a recipe of 3 words for you, which we use actually in Catalan context, where we have been tensioned and polarized so much. But I think it applies to many others. We need to treat each other better in society, and we need 3 words: curiosity, respect, and self-criticism. Curiosity, because if we are not curious about why somebody else thinks differently from us, then we cannot have a dialogue and we cannot transform. Respect, because we need to respect all the human beings, no matter what they think. And self-criticism, because nobody has the complete truth. Nobody ever. If we use these 3 terms, which actually in Catalan are curiosidad, respecta, and autocrítica, they build up cura. Cura is cuidado, care. We bring this in from feminism. If we treat each other with care, and with these 3 words, I think this is a simple recipe for healthy democracies.
Yes.
That's wonderful. I would just add the role of education, because I think there's a lot that can be done with schools, with arts, with culture. Young people, they go to the cinema, they listen to music, and so this work of working on the memory, of trying to understand the different truths about the past and how can we build like a joint future. I mean, this can really start at the childhood, and maybe the next generation then will be more educated about their own past and about the will to also work on their future.
Yes, we have an experience here in the Spanish state because there has been silence about the Civil War, and our generation never really knew what happened. Our parents, and there was silence. And somehow we should try for that not to happen now, but it's not very easy. And Christian mentioned before how conflicts are changing in the world. By the description you gave, we could say the conflict here belongs to the past world, to the past model of conflicts. But do you think it could somehow, with the innovations we have talked about, become a bridge towards conflict resolution with the lessons that can be learned from civil society's involvement, which I know happens in other parts of the world, but you have said here it has been different?
As I mentioned, and I think Vera, you can maybe dig deeper into that, but that's already happening. But again, we all learn from each other. I've learned a lot from this peace process, so I feel very privileged of having been invited and being able to listen and participate. I learned from Veronique, who I knew before meeting her here, just from reading her stuff, and I thought she was brilliant and very interesting, and I was so excited to meet her a few years ago. Thank you to you bringing us together. I was reminded the peace process in the Basque Country and Colombia ran parallel at a certain time, and it's very interesting, and things that were taboo here were not the problem in Colombia, and the other way around. So in Colombia, it was impossible for FARC to talk about disarmament. That's a taboo word. But here, that was not a problem. But here, it was very difficult to address the issue of victims, of asking for forgiveness for the violence committed against victims, whether from ETA or from the state. And FARC had not, and government in Colombia, after pressure from civil society, had not a problem. So it was very interesting how processes that run parallel also learn from each other. No matter if now looking forward, the world is changing, maybe Ukraine will not learn specifically from the Basque Country, but other conflicts of self-determination that are still raging in different countries in Asia and Africa especially can certainly learn a lot, but you will probably have.
There's a lot that current conflicts and peace processes can learn from here, even though every process is different. I mean, even just this space, the Permanent Social Forum, as a way, as I said before, of enabling an inclusive and participatory process from the bottom up, that can be applied in many other contexts. And I know that there's a lot of entities here that have been very generous in providing space and time for others to come and learn about that and to hear testimonies of how this has been done. I would love to have a Basque Social Forum representative in any of my trips to those places when I'm going around the world, because I think there's so much that they could share. On the question of weapons, I'm looking at what's happening now in Colombia with the negotiations with the ELN guerrilla, where again, the issue of weapons, it's a repetition of the FARC is like, no, we will deal with this at the end. We will not even disarm. I think that's some people in the ELN are saying. But because it's an organization that is claiming to speak for its people, to want movements at the table, to want society to be involved, I think they might be inspired by the way that it's been done here in a, again, not unilateral process, but a process of interlocution between them and their base. So yeah, I hope that that these ideas, these seeds can be planted everywhere.
Well, before we put an end to this very interesting talks, would you like to add anything else? And I have a final heartfelt question to you with our heartfelt thanks. How do you feel today, personally, as persons, sharing this last social forum with us? I know it's a very questionable person, because I think we're all living through this with very much intensity. It's been a great experience for us all.
Well, I feel very honored for having been given the opportunity and the trust in following that process through. I mean, I haven't been attending all of the social forums, but for those that have had the pleasure to attend, to have even a chance to help to formulate some of the recommendations of the first social forum, that's been a real privilege, and that's been one of the important moments of my career, I have to say. I feel proud and impressed by your relentless persistence and determination to continue and to move forward despite all the obstacles. And I feel also convinced that the last recommendations that have not been implemented yet will be eventually soon, and I hope I'll be here to witness again when this happens. So thanks for your trust.
It's exciting. It's not very often for those who work for peace and those of you who have lived through this conflict for so many decades to say change happened really in your lifetime. And as a consequence of each one of your contribution as an individual or as an organization, it's tremendous. It's very exciting, and I think one of the most, what me personally inspires me more in my peace work is when I meet with people who have suffered conflict and violence, and they are willing and able to contribute for other people not to go through what they went through. I've seen here in this context, I've seen victims of ETA in Catalonia, I've seen victims of violence in Colombia and other places becoming the true peace builders. I've seen former combatants from armed groups who used to kill and to impose their ideas and to decide they want to become peace builders, and if the opportunities are given, they want to and they can end up contributing to change in society. These personal changes are the real power of transformation, and you see them in all the peace processes, and here of course as well. And having been able to witness some of them has been a privilege as well. And the human being can get the worst of itself. We need to be realistic about that. But we have a tremendous power of transformation as human beings, as individuals, and all together. And the peace process brings that. And in this case, when we are now closing, one more very relevant step in the transformation of this society. Thank you to your participation. It's tremendous, it's very exciting, it's very moving.
Well, if you have nothing else to add, I suppose there would be a lot to speak about, but there will be time. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, all of you, for this very interesting talk, listening to it.
Thank you.
And I'm sure you'll be welcome here anytime you want to come.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you.
Eskerrik asko guztioi.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks to the speakers. Thanks to the attendees. We're going to enjoy a cup of coffee, some biscuits, and we're going to resume this session at 6:15. Please be back on time. See you in a bit. Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen. Let's resume.
Acercándonos en este caso al proceso de construcción de paz sucedido aquí. Desde el Foro Social Permanente siempre han dicho que, y ya lo hemos escuchado hoy también, su método de trabajo ha sido...
The Permanent Social Forum has always said that the way they have worked has helped them stand out in this peace-building process. They've been able to identify hurdles, learning from other experiences, issuing recommendations based on international standards. And here in the Permanent Social Forum, we've always tried to look for consensus. They have their own way of communication. They have avoided using some terms, and they have been characterized by their serene, proactive attitude, their willingness to listen, and this tone has gained many supporters, has created a movement. This has contributed to creating more inclusive concepts that have been assimilated by many stakeholders. On the 18th of February, in a meeting with the civil society in Condestable, we saw that much progress has been made since the first social forum. And this has been thanks to the 3 contributions of the Permanent Social Forum since 2016. This forum has designed a roadmap, an agenda with no interferences, and they have been able to work based on the principle of reality, proposing feasible solutions that enjoyed the agreement of others, that enjoy the support of society, what we call the central lane. Secondly, we, the Permanent Social Forum, have been able to create an innovative way of working, a constructive way of working that avoids confrontation with sensible, reasonable proposals, always willing to go a step forward, to go an extra mile. And the needs of the social forum have little by little permeated in the public narrative, and we have been able to make much headway thanks to dialogue, actual dialogue. And we have 3 lanes: País Vasco Francés, the French Basque Country, Navarre, and the Basque Autonomous Region. We have adapted to the specificity of each territory, to the tools and instruments of each territory, always pursuing a common goal. But in spite of the progress made, we now embark on a new journey that is not without difficulties and challenges. Now we're going to start a round table during which we're going to address these challenges. We enjoy the presence of Anais Funosas, Paul Rios, and this roundtable will be chaired by Maider. You have the floor. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon, for bearing with us. Well, the good thing about being the last to take the floor is that, well, many things have been mentioned already during the afternoon. Today, we're going to address progress and pending challenges, and some of these challenges have already been pinpointed. And in the 2 previous roundtable, somebody at some moment in time has mentioned the speakers that are now part of this roundtable, and they have been referred to by their first name. This means that there's 3 persons that are here with me on stage on behalf of an organization have been very personally committed to this process. Well, I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers. We enjoy the presence of Agus Hernan, who has worked as an advisor, and he has been engaged in Radio Anseta, and since 2016 he has coordinated the social forum. So Agnus has made a significant contribution to the forum. We also enjoy the presence of Anais Bornosa, who holds a degree in sociology, activist for the rights of prisoners before chairing Baquevidea, Artisans of Peace, the first group of the Basque Country that organized, together with Locari, the first social forum back in 2012. And last, we enjoy the presence of Paul Rios, who holds a degree in law. Paul has been engaged in this field for a very long time, and Paul has coordinated Locari, has been the spokesperson for Locari, the citizen network that worked to promote peace. And he participated as a facilitator and organizer in the Gallete conference of 2011. And Paul is currently an independent consultant and provides advice for other projects. And first, I'm going to set the scene. We're going to set the scene together. We've asked them to please, in 10 minutes, share with us their testimony, how they have lived this process. Paul, you have the floor first. Thanks very much, Maider. It's a pleasure for me to be here with all of you this afternoon. Well, time flies. 10 years have passed by, and it's crazy what we have accomplished. And the same thing happened to us 2 years ago. Remember when we celebrated the anniversary of the Ayete conference? But fortunately, we're now better off than then. That's good. And I believe that we can pat our shoulders, we can be happy and satisfied, and say this openly. I'd also like to say that I'm here, speaking on my own terms. I'm here as Paul. I'm not representing any organization. It's true that Locari's legacy, something that I always carry with me. And I've always had a strong commitment with Locari, but all the ideas that I'm going to share with you today are my personal views and opinions. I wanted to make this clear from the onset so that you don't believe that I'm speaking on behalf of an organization. I wanted to mention this first to avoid misunderstandings and so that you understand my contribution. And one of the reasons why we are better off today is because the Permanent Social Forum has done a wonderful task over the past years, and I'd like to thank them for creating new opportunities for the work they've done, and many names came to my mind. I'd like to mention Agus, Fernando, Miquel, Juanjo, Tere, Santi, and many others, Gorka, who's here in the room, and many others who have worked hard and that have been pushing to find a solution and to demonstrate that civil society could play a central role in peace building. And we've shown that we can collaboratively address the challenge of peaceful coexistence. So I'd like to give you my heartfelt acknowledgement and my recognition. And having said this, let's travel back together in time. Let's go back to the 17th of October 2011 when Locari, together with other organizations, among them the Berhova Foundation and Conciliation Resources, organized the International Conference of Peace of San Sebastian, known as the Ayete Conference, and 3 days later it announced the end of violence. Being honest, what was our expectation back then? Well, that after the announcement, a classical traditional peace process would be opened following the format that was described earlier by Veronique and Christian, a series of talks and conversations between the government of Spain and ETA to address the consequences of long years of violence. I remember that in January 2011, there was a meeting of the International Contact Group chaired by Brian Curran coming in London. And Nula was one of the members of the group. and she was a lady of the UK, and that meeting was held at the Chamber of Lords. It was pretty amazing, and during that meeting, we were able to share information, and we concluded that the government of Spain wasn't willing to accept the proposal of the previous government to initiate or launch conversations or talks. And it takes two to tango, as you know. And peace processes, as these are traditionally understood, we also need two to tango. This is no exception. And in our case, one of the dancers, the government of Spain, wasn't willing to go out to the dance floor. So there was no dance, there was no tango, there was no process apparently, and we thought that we were at a deadlock. And since then, we at Locari in 2012 proposed an alternative path, an alternative solution. What we suggested was that instead of focusing our efforts around what the Spanish government or ETA could do, we decided to give the leading role to society. Our premise was that the direct beneficiaries of a peace process wouldn't be neither the government nor ETA. What was at stake was our peaceful coexistence and our future as a society that would respect plurality, human rights, and the Basque region. And we asked the government and ETA to stop, with their way of doing, and we asked them to please focus on the needs of society. But this is not enough. This doesn't suffice. This is only the beginning. And as of then, we started shaping proposals to find solutions that everybody deemed reasonable. And that's when we started organizing the social forum. They've asked me to take the floor first because of the Ayete conference, but the first forum was organized in Bayonne. It was organized by our colleagues. With our collaboration, and that event in Bayona was very, very moving, very exciting. We were all very excited in the room. We all had this willingness to make progress, to build, to close a previous stage, and we felt, great emotion in that room that inspired us. That gave us, great strength and the desire to do something similar in Iparralde and in Egualde. And it was a difficult day as well, because one of the things that we had been doing during that time was to work with a group of representatives from almost all the political parties, with the exception of Front National. And these political parties had engaged in a discrete dialogue process as a result of the Ayete conference. And it was a bit hard, and we ended up the day with great difficulties, but it's true that we were able to give momentum to the process in Iparralde and Anaí, so I'm sure will tell us more about this. In Iparralde, they had this collaboration spaces, but in Egualde, as we say, we were faced other difficulties, other challenges, and we thought that it would be important to organize peace social forum also in Egualde. And this wasn't our own idea. This was the result of some conversations between different stakeholders. And I'll leave it here. I won't disclose the info. You can, of course, approach me at the exit, and I'll be willing to give you the info. This very same idea of doing a social forum enjoyed a certain degree of consensus. What was the first difficulty we found when organizing this social forum? Well, we had to find of international stakeholders that could inspire us. As Veronique and Christian said, you learn from other processes, and we wanted to learn from what others had done in order to take it from there and generate new ideas. And up until 15 days before the meetings day, we didn't have our list of experts, international experts. In the end, we were able to make it. And we also wanted to create a good environment of collaboration among the different political parties. Some political parties had great mistrust and regarding the initiative. In the end, we were able to hold that first social forum second in 2013 with a double session both in Pamplona and in Bilbao. It was a major success because of its content and because we had summoned a broad representation of civil society. And when I teach at uni or when I do lectures for people working the field of peace process facilitation, I always carry with me a picture of the social forum of Pamplona and Bilbao because it conveys very clearly that idea of the social society sitting around the table to try to generate new ideas. So we organized the social forum and we understood that we had to issue a series of recommendations stemming for the forum in order to contribute to peace. And that's when we faced our first big contradiction, and that's why we started with our self-criticism, or at least how I have myself criticized how we managed the social forum. Locari didn't only summon the forum on its own. It did so with other organizations like Dicarte and Baucha. So we had to agree on the recommendations with the different political parties and with different organizations involved or engaged in the peace process. And we had to do things very well, because we had to ensure a certain degree of agreement with the ideas. They didn't have to stamp their signature on our document, but if we wanted it to be a starting point, we had to reach a certain degree of consensus, and this consultation process was done with everybody. We also engaged the international mediators in this consultation process. Also with the government of Spain, we informed the government of Spain of the content of our work. And one of the things that we were asked was to please be very discreet when drafting the recommendations. And how can you marry this discretion with the fact that we have many different organizations involved? Conclusion. Well, perhaps there was another path that could have been followed, but we decided to issue the recommendations ourselves, and that's it. And of course, it was a bit unilateral, doesn't marry very well with this idea of being a social forum. But we were able to conclude our work. We issued a total of 12 recommendations. And these recommendations set a series of principles regarding disarmament, reconciliation, human rights, victims, and in hindsight, I believe that these recommendations laid the groundwork and some common rules. And thanks to this groundwork and these common rules, we've been able to make progress thanks to the inspiration of those 12 recommendations. For me, the most important outcome is that civil society felt that it had a space to engage, and thanks to the forum, they felt they were an active contributor to the peace process, and this is essential. It's a distinctive feature of our process. The fact that we feel that we play a central role, a leading role, that we feel that what has been accomplished is the outcome of our work, of our efforts. It's us who have done this. It's us who have been able to table solutions. And this doesn't mean that, I was self-critical earlier, and I'll continue with this self-criticism. Well, after that social forum, we issued recommendations and we created a commission to manage recommendations. Well, processes are always complicated, tortuous, thorny, and we had the feeling that there was an agenda, hidden agenda that wasn't being shared with us and with the committee where Fernando Merdadi was involved, and we left that committee on standby with the consequences this had. It was hard for the people that were members of that committee that were left, on standby after being summoned. But there's no perfect peace process. Should they be? They'd be like a Hollywood film. And peace processes are more like French films. That was complicated. Some weeks ago, I participated in a discrete meeting to share our experiences with people trying to promote a peace process in a South American country. I'm not going to name it. And the discussion centered around the idea of whether social construction, in our case, had been decisive or had it played a determining role. 10 years later, I believe that what has happened would have happened regardless of the presence of the social forum, because the groundwork was there. But I'm truly convinced that without the forum, without those first two fora, without the work of Baquevidea, and in 2016 a series of people decided to revamp or relaunch the initiative of the forum, and have been working hard up to this day. With all this prior work, this process would have been much more complicated, much more tortuous, and it would have been much more similar to a traditional process in which, everything happens in hidden places, and society basically has to accept the result or the outcome of the negotiation. The society remains passive. But thanks to the work of the forum, society has played a central role, an active role, proposing suggestions, solutions, facilitating, and looking for those consensus building elements. Desiree Nilsson is a Swedish researcher, and she analyzed almost 80 peace processes, and she reached a pretty worrying conclusion. She said that 60% of these processes failed in the first 5 years after the agreement is signed. And those that are able to go beyond this 5-year hurdle are processes in which social participation had played a central role. In our case, the society has played a very proactive role. We have felt part and parcel in this process towards peace. And I'm going to conclude, if I may, stating that I'm truly convinced that our society and the social forum made a solid contribution to this. And after having analyzed the work done and the road traveled over the past 10 years, we can say that it was really worth it. So congratulations, everybody.
Naitz, zer dezu horretan partekatzeko?
Thank you. I'm going to share the experience of Iparralde, the French Basque Country, and I'd like to set the scene of what happened in Ayete from the perspective of Iparralde. Before Ayete, we lived, a very special time. The French state had embarked on a process of reflection, and this process was against ETA and the Abertzale left. And we were in a spiral of raids, weekly raids. We saw that many operations were launched against political parties. And there was a European warrant issued against someone in particular, and when that warrant was issued, everything changed. That was the turning point. And the atmosphere back then was an atmosphere of a huge political repression, unbearable repression. And there was a common feeling back then that is worth mentioning. We all felt that the path of repression wasn't able to help us overcome this political conflict. We understood that we had to embark on a democratic process, and the institutionalization of Euskal Herria, was something that was discussed by everybody from all political parties back then. There was a political dialogue on the desire to build Iparralde and to create a new institution. And this repression, was very detrimental to that dialogue, a dialogue that had to be a serene dialogue. And that's when Ayete took place, when the conference took place. And I believe that Ayete for Iparralde opened a window of opportunity, not only vis-a-vis the peace process, but also vis-a-vis territoriality. Thanks to the Ayete conference, we understood that we had a historic opportunity ahead of us. In order for Iparralde, for the French Basque Country, or the North Basque Country, to address this topic in a responsible manner, in order to be able to find potential solutions so that from the North Basque Country we could also contribute to the discussion. Ayete institutionalized territoriality. We enjoyed a representation of trade unionists and politicians from the North Basque Country that were invited to participate in the Ayete conference, and the French state also participated and was mentioned as a stakeholder. We also enjoyed the presence of many international experts and this gave great legitimacy to the process. Pierre Joc is a former minister that is one of the international experts that participated in the conference, and Pierre Joc was the head of the Ministry of Home Affairs during the GAL, and this person was a renowned professional that gave his political support to this initiative.
And in fact, when the Ayete conference was held, 3 days later, the armed organization actually responded in a very positive way to the suggestion, the proposal made at Ayete. And that was when, in the Northern Basque Country, there was a lot of impetus was generated. And that was when we decided that we couldn't just hang around and wait for the fruits of this negotiation to fall to your feet. And because the Northern Basque Country wasn't known throughout the world for its relationship with the conflict as the Southern Basque Country was, so the Northern Basque Country, I think, realized that it could have a very important role to play in all of this. And we decided that we should really adopt this roadmap and to adopt the method that was being used. And this is when we really started to work. And immediately we started to structure the peace process. And I'm talking about peace processes because that exists in the Northern Basque Country, and I'll explain what I mean by that. We took a step forward in order to organize the process, so it was civil society that was doing this. There were a lot of contacts already made among civil society, and those who were present at Ayete also participated in this deliberation and took on this responsibility in a very discreet way. And this is when we had the political representatives who got together with a mandate, and their mandate was to try to envisage how a negotiation would be between ETA and the French state from the point of view of the conclusions or the outcomes of Ayete. And looking at the outcomes, we're going to organize ourselves. We had one thing very clear in our minds, and that was what Ayete says in point 4 of the declaration, is that we need to organize an inclusive dialogue. We have to see what we're going to talk about, how we're going to talk about, what are the sort of points of conflict that we really need to address. And we decided that we needed to empower ourselves at that moment in time. And in order to do that, we needed to train. We needed to understand, and we needed to really internalize issues that perhaps we hadn't really thought about in the past, concepts that were unknown to us, that we weren't talking about, that didn't form part of the public debate about the peace process. And that was the responsibility of another council, and we got down to work. A lot of work was carried out. The first social forum was held with 400 people. It was a resounding success. 250 of these people were social stakeholders and politicians. And when all of these people come together, I mean, you might not believe this, but we spent 13 hours in an auditorium and no one left. I don't know how we did it. I still don't know how we did it. I'm still trying to work out what happened. But we spent 13 hours working out who had to do what, who had to contribute what, and then from there on, we just went step by step, section by section, and little by little, we understood more. Our understanding grew. And the international experts helped us to do that. But basically, they contributed by giving us the idea that we couldn't just copy and paste a solution that had worked somewhere else. That was the main idea. They taught us we had to build our own peace process. That was the main idea. That was the main lesson learned. So we started to envisage a possible peace process. And there were two thoughts, really, that were bounding around constantly. First of all, there was a feeling that the northern Basque Country wasn't particularly well known because the French state hadn't recognized its participation, so that we needed a cross-cutting agreement in order to justify this. The fact that there was a roadmap that was feasible and that was accepted. So we needed civil society to support this exercise. And then this brought us up to 2014, the 24th of October, when we had the Declaration of Bayonne. And in the Declaration of Bayonne, there was one thing that was very clear. Throughout everything that we'd done, a negotiation between ETA and the French state, this negotiating table actually became the roadmap for the French civil society. A lot of work was carried out by the International Commission, and this working team really helped us a lot. And they were inspired by what had happened in Ireland previously to see how we could come up with a solution to all the different conclusions that had been drawn. So an ordered solution which complied with current legislation, which left to one side the sort of exceptional legislation that had been enacted within this situation. And this is where a very, very powerful political agenda was established. And this political agenda envisaged the need for institutionalization. For me, this was a key point, because from that moment on, we had the conflict resolution sort of was joined and merged with the idea of territoriality. And they both fed into each other, both of these concepts. And the obstacles of one element was an obstacle in the other element. So these two questions would, from then on, be developed in tandem. And this is how we little by little got rid of all the obstacles. This was the roadmap that Paul was talking about. We've developed it. We're in different forums with different protests. It's been an ongoing work, and it's been a huge amount of work as well. But there is a very clear feeling that this negotiating table is not going to be made up. Spain's not going to establish it because they don't want to, but it's not going to be France either. So in the northern Basque Country, a feeling arose that, okay, fair enough, if we don't have these people to negotiate with, well, let's ourselves go to the table. And it'll be us who fight for this agenda. It's going to be we who defend and advocate for this agenda. We're going to turn it into a reality. And I would say that during those 3 years, a lot of issues have come up, and a lot of issues have been dealt with, and it's been really key to furthering our understanding of the whole process. And all the deliberations that should have happened in the negotiating table Each comma, each reference, each word that was used, we'd already done it. It was already there. We knew where we were going. We knew where we were going to end up, where this process was going to take us, which is why I think that we actually reached a place, we reached the point of no return. And this enabled us to impose the will of the Northern Basque Country on both the state and on the Southern Basque Country. So, thanks to that, from the periphery, we actually had a major impact. And I think it's also important to remember the disarmament, which was a very difficult moment, but it was a very, very important moment, and that happened in the Northern Basque Country. I think had an impact on the whole of the Basque Country, and that was a very important moment. It was a key moment, especially for all the different steps that have gone afterwards. I'm not going to talk about the disarmament. If you come to San Sebastian tomorrow, then you'll hear Church talking about it. But the disarmament should be the conclusion, right? It's the sort of the last piece in the puzzle of a peace process. But what we did was make our own roadmap, and we just, went straight for disarmament because the process was in danger. Because this whole idea of there being winners and losers, this was gaining ground. It was becoming more popular, and we all knew that there was a certain group who said that, that this was clear, but for us it wasn't. Disarmament actually was just a starting point. It was just a first step. And I think there was a collective assuming of responsibilities, and ETA delegated its responsibility or passed or transferred its responsibility to the civil society so that civil society could continue to overcome this blockade and this deadlock. The disarmament at the moment was very tense, but it was an important step because it laid the groundwork for a kind of a new impetus to be generated in the Southern Basque Country. And that was where the social forum really took advantage of it. It picked it up and ran with it. And thanks to that, we were able to create sort of this new type of negotiation, this new dialogue. And we established a Basque Country Council with representatives of the community, of politicians, etc. It was called El Cargo. And we had representatives of the political institution that now actually governs that region in the Northern Basque Country. And the idea was that all of this was going to move forward together in tandem. And this is when we went to the ministry. Now, when we arrived at the ministry, we were convinced that the Declaration of Bayona was the roadmap we had to follow, but there was no willingness there really in the government to do this. And this willingness could only be achieved if we kept up the pressure to see whether we were actually able to move from one era to another to a new era and gaining strength as we did it. And I think that was a really important thing that we did there because we managed to convince most of the elected representatives in the Northern Basque Country to actually declare themselves in favour of peace. And so the governing body really put pressure on Paris, and a number of different declarations were approved. And I don't think we weren't able to establish the dialogue we wanted, but I think we did manage to make sure that the peace process was a top priority. And there were moments of tension. I mean, there were obviously elections. At some point in the process, there were different attacks on the Basque language, for example. Different elements all came into play, quite conflictive elements in some cases. But in the Northern Basque Country, at least, there was I think we achieved some very important milestones, really moving milestones. And I think that legitimacy is more important than legality. And I firmly believe, that guaranteeing people's rights should be the norm, not the exception. So, last July, on the 23rd of July, 1,700 citizens, artisans of peace, disobeyed the order that came down from Paris and the counter-terrorism unit. They disobeyed the order that was passed down from Paris. With a very clear intention to make a statement. Now, even though the French state doesn't recognize this peace process, the courts do recognize the need to grant parole to political prisoners, and the reintegration of political prisoners has become a really important part of ensuring the stability of the peace process. And after 10 years of struggles, I believe this is a very important achievement. It's been a collective victory. After a process, prisoners should be sent home. I mean, that's just logical. And we need a guarantee. We need a commitment from elected representatives and civil society. It's true that I've been talking for a bit too long. We do need to just wrap up now. So let me finish. I know we've got some questions afterwards. I can perhaps talk a little bit more then, but let me just finish by saying that without Ayete, we wouldn't be where we are today. Without Ayete, we wouldn't be where we are today. So 10 years ago, I don't think any of us could have imagined that here in the southern Basque Country and here in Navarre, we would be sitting here today, and I would be sitting here with people who have very different political ideas from me. But over the last 10 years, there have been 3 different types of civil society moving at 3 different rhythms and paces. But I think that despite that, I think we've had a shared goal throughout the entire process, and we've pursued that goal all together. And I think that we have many reasons to congratulate ourselves. We've gone through some very difficult times, all of us, but we're here, and we're all very, very delighted to be here with you this afternoon, this evening.
Bai, nik uste ondo dagoela bai, zuen lehenengo ekarpen honetan ere.
Well, I think it's good. It's very positive. The fact that, in fact, you, in your first addresses, you're actually asking the first question I was going to ask you later on about the process, about the role of civil society in this process, because civil society really made a major contribution. And my first question, in fact, was going to be about the role of civil society in the process, but you're already answering that. Because I wanted you to talk about the differences between the northern and the southern Basque countries. Right, well, I have to speak third, so that's really, really difficult, right? Because we've got everyone, we have Paul just talking now, and then tomorrow we've got church, so I don't really know what to say, to be perfectly honest. I'm in a bit of a bad situation here. So let's think about where we came from to understand the period. In 2015, that was when I met Paul during coffee breaks in Itziar. We stopped halfway. We started having coffee together, and he was talking about Locarri. And then we also had Bakebi there, which in 2015 in spring organized a conference in Paris. And then there was a manifesto, which I think was signed by 120 French figures, saying, look, there's something you can be done about this. Because we didn't think there was anything that could be done. There was no solution at the time. Now, the Permanent Social Forum was established in 2017 in a situation of deadlock, as we've heard. A situation of deadlock. We all remember. the declarations by Minister Rajoy, who was Minister of the Interior at the time. He said, no, it's really easy. They just have to leave all their weapons, in the car park of a supermarket and we'll come and collect them. And problem solved. That was what he said at the time. And also, and this is something that I've discovered later on, and that was the presence of mistrust. So, in this context, we organised the third social forum. It wasn't an easy option because we didn't really know whether we had to focus on all the different themes or just on specific themes. Because, in fact, this is the first time we've had a forum that's talking about all the different themes. We've generally just focused on one theme. So we had the third social forum. Now, Veronique is very discreet, but I remember that civil disarmament was actually proposed by the Berghoff Foundation, thanks to Veronique, the idea of civil society. I think that was, there present right from the very first social forum. And at that time, and with the different recommendations that we had at the time, we were almost like pilgrims. We wandered around the place, having all sorts of meetings with all sorts of different stakeholders. This was before the establishment of the permanent social forum. We had a meeting with Ushue Barcos, another meeting with the president of the Basque Country, Mr. Urkullu. But I remember in the first 15 minutes, the president talked, and I'm talking about the mistrust that was there at that time. Back then, between 2011, the end of Oslo, 2012, and then 2016, all the initiatives, rather than generating opportunities, in my opinion, they just generated more mistrust. And they just strengthened the space of mistrust. And I'm talking about all sorts of different stakeholders, but mainly in this case, the President Urkullu talked about the Abrazale left, and there was a lot of mistrust around at that time. So this was really difficult, and I was thinking, I don't know how we're going to get out of this. Now, I don't know if you remember, after Urkullu's intervention, Mr. Urkullu's intervention, I took the floor and I said, right, well, can we just get down to work? And then that was when a working space was established. And what was the third contextual element that I remember of that time? Ayete, in the first social forum, I think they filled the swimming pool with water, the swimming pool of the process, but the water was freezing cold. And we had to heat the water up because otherwise no one was going to go jump in at all. And that was my first experience with consensus building. So the first process in which we went round and we talked to all the different trade unions, political parties, parliament representatives, two main trade unions, the two presidents, President Urkullu and President Ushue Barcos, the president of Navarre. This generated a consensus that was very simple, but it was very strong. And that was, ETA can disarm in any way it likes, it just has to disarm, as long as it disarms. That was the consensus. And then we had the permanent social forum, which was set up at the same time. And the organizational space of the forum was established. I remember we had a debate with Anais about whether we should have an association or lots of different entities. And we were ambitious, which is difficult. Because, getting different entities to agree is difficult. I remember when we were writing the agreements, Christian, you said that we have to do everything by consensus. You can't make a decision, a simple majority. It was his fault, basically. But that was the culture that we have actually managed to build as a result of that. And in this context, we established a permanent social forum. We presented it on the 5th anniversary. And all of a sudden, there was a very plural political photo. The socialists weren't there at the time, but we had the PMV party. We had Bildu, I think it was called Bildu by then. Geroa Bai was there as well, etc. All the different political parties and all the different trade unions as well. And that was the moment in which the forum said, okay, we believe that we're strong enough to try to, push for the disarmament from civil society. Everyone looked at us as if we were completely bonkers, mad as hatters. They said, how can you possibly go about pushing for a disarmament without the cooperation of the state? Well, we did. we know what happened. We all know what happened. That things got complicated sometimes. The civil guard was there, but then 4 months later, it was the 8th of April. Everything just started going very, very quickly. And I and myself, we went to talk to before the two parliaments. There was huge pressure, but the forum had a plan B at the time. In the southern Basque Country, if the government of Rajoy decided to try to stop it with arrests, we had a plan B. We knew how we were going to react if people started getting arrested. Now, it's easy to say that today, but at the time it was a really difficult situation. Having said that, in Navarre, there was one element that was fundamental, and that was that there was a change of government. And we had President Josué Barcos. And that opened up many different windows of opportunity, windows which had been firmly shut with the previous government. And this is when we have our first roundtable in the Navarre Parliament on the 4th of November 2016 with 8 victims of different types of violence. And that just sort of laid the groundwork of a working style. And you all know what happened next. Now, I know that round table, I think we learnt 2 things from it. First of all, the huge potential that was there in putting victims together, victims of different types of violence, that huge potential that was there. It was like, okay, we can do this. Why can't you do that as well? So it's like, in a situation of, chronic mistrust, that was very powerful. And it was true that what we saw very clearly that Navarre needed to forge its own path. And we needed to adapt everything to the specific idiosyncrasies of Navarre. That was another thing that we learned very clearly in that. And then things got faster and faster. They started going faster after that. I would just like to say one thing. The working space with the political parties, the day after disarmament, we started to talk to all the different political parties to think about how we were going to structure this, how we were going to organize discrete spaces for dialogue. The very next day. Exactly. Before the disarmament, we had a number of different projects. There were some press conferences in Bilbao with all the political parties except for the socialists. And then there was another one with all the political parties and all the trade unions as well. And I think this showed that things were moving, that walls were being broken down little by little. And I think there are 2 phases in up to 2018 and then from 2018 to 2022, 2 phases in the social forum. In the first phase, the landmarks are well known. The civil disarmament and the dissolution of ETA. And then we have the consensus with regard to this and then in the second period, we have consensuses around political prisoners. We have changes in legislation. And also with regard to victims. And then in this phase, there are 3 things that happen, which I think are very important. In this debate between unilaterality and multilaterality, which I think really, I don't know how useful it is. So there was a debate about how to adapt the initial decisions that were taken in 2014 to the new situation. Because why did we actually decide to have a debate that was monothematic, just focusing on disarmament? Because we knew it was going to be a major change. It was going to change everything. We were going to open up a whole load of new opportunities. Secondly, a little bit later on, it was made public that ETA was talking about its dissolution and debating its own dissolution. And in this context, we're moving up towards 2018, where we had the dissolution of ETA. An ordered, internationally verified dissolution with a huge degree of political census around that decision. I'm not talking about how it was signified, I'm talking about the decision-making process itself. And secondly, we had Mr. Pedro Sanchez, and he won the elections, and unilaterally, in an interview, I think it was the 7th of July, an interview on Spanish television, he announced 3 measures, and the third measure was to do with bringing the Basque prisoners closer to home. No one expected it. I certainly didn't expect it. And we sort of thought, oh, well, everything we've been doing is actually bearing fruit. I was, and in fact, a member of the ministry told us when we were having a coffee up in Ayete one day that, you know, this isn't coincidence. This is the result of everything that you have been doing. Let me move forward in time. So, we've been talking about different landmarks, no? Dissolution, disarmament, everything that happened with the prisoners, victims, etc. But I think the most important contribution made by the forum, well, I think there are three of them. We have the culture of dialogue. That was one of them. The culture of dialogue. There was a theory of the 3%, which I was told not to use because everyone thinks about Pujol in Catalonia. So I'm going to change it, and it's the theory of the 5%. So after the disarmament, we talked to all the different political parties, and we identified the fact that we were actually, we agreed on 5% of the issues. And now you might say, bah, there's nothing to be done. But in fact, we changed our view and said, hey, look, you know, we agree on 5% of the things. So, you know, let's start from there. That's the theory of the 5%. And that's the theory and the idea that has impregnated the forum. Now, today, we can't talk about the debates that we held. We're not allowed to. All the different multitudes of dialogues. Victims know about it. Different political parties know about it. There was a lot of debate about prison policy. We know that there have been lots of debates in Pamplona, so we know about some of the debates, but there were many, many more debates that took place, and we're not allowed to talk about them yet. We don't have permission because we don't want to cause ourselves problems. And then there's the idea of that there's sort of a patchwork kind of peace process. So sort of things happened in a bit of a, you know, a strange order, if you like. And this together has moved forward a peace process that in each area, people were just moving at their own pace. They reached conclusions and consensus at their own pace. But we knew that there was feedback between the different areas. And we've talked about memory as well. And the battle of the narrative as well, which is a very difficult issue. And we've done all of this in a holistic way. We've done it all at the same time. So there are differences of opinion, of course. Some people think it's just a political problem. Other people think it's something else. But we're not there to resolve this debate. And the third thing is that we have managed to establish an ecosystem which is favorable and conducive to a resolution. The status quo wasn't an option. We had to build this culture between all the different stakeholders on the firm conviction that we had to sort this out.
Even if these are baby steps. And I'd like to finish off by saying that we are entering a new stage. We're closing the stage and opening up a new one until the elections take place. And this is spring of 2024. We won't start a new stage. And this new stage will be completely different. We will have to wait and see whether what we have accomplished so far, and I'm convinced this is going to be the case. Tomorrow we'll be talking about the 12 learnings. And I'm convinced that what we have done up until now will help to pave the way to a bright future. Of course, we will have to see what the situation is in the Navarre Parliament and the Basque Parliament. But my feeling is that the progress we have made is consolidated progress, and it's here to stay. And I believe that we are living a very special moment in time. I think we have gained momentum, and this is a momentum that we won't lose. So, in short, I believe that this process, and I'm going to quote Jonathan Powell on the 10th anniversary of Ayete, this is a process that has flown with one sole wing, but it's been able to fly and take to the sky. We're all convinced here that this has been the case. The civil society has been a driver for change, has been able to summon all the different stakeholders, both in the southern Basque Country and in the northern Basque Country, the trade unions, the civil society, the political parties have reached an agreement. And I like to insist on this idea of this being a shared process, a joint process. This way of building together, jointly, joining forces. And I'd like to personally thank them all. Paul explained earlier the problem of discretion in an open space. And Christian and his document, foundational document of the social forum, said that we had to bring together these two spaces of discretion that couldn't be shared and open spaces. I'd like to thank the members of the forum for letting us do, for giving us this trust, for trusting us and letting us do. And discretion is of the essence in these processes. Without discretion, you break this principle of loyalty, and it's very important that you build on this foundation. I think that we've all learned a great deal. And the other day in the forum, we decided that it was time to submit the archive to the ESCAO. And we've had, long conversations because we decided in the end not to make public part of the archive. There are still some people that need to continue working together, reaching agreements together. It's still premature to share a part of the archive. Why? Because there are still pending issues. There are still things to be done, and we need to continue structuring this process. I don't know if I'm perhaps speaking too much. When you get us three together, we can't stop talking. Well, no worries. It's okay. There's still much that needs to be done, much to be discussed, and still a lot to do. Well, we only have 10 minutes ahead, I'm afraid. So, at this point, I'd like you to please improvise. And I'm going to ask you to expand further on the roles of civil society, but we're going to open up a round of contributions around two main ideas. On the one hand, we need to weave the process. We need to weave together, two pieces of fabric. We need to, continue consolidating this patchwork process. We've been weaving consensus. We've been weaving this process. We've been contributing to this patchwork. Any idea regarding this methodology, this way of working that has led to this patchwork, if I may say? And what's pending? What's to be done? What's on the punch list? And of course, we can continue with our conversations tomorrow. What's to be done? Paul, you have the floor. Well, I don't know, sewing, weaving, lokari, saritu. Tends to use these terms as well. I wouldn't use these verbs myself. On the one hand, the social forum, of course, issues recommendations. I explained how hard it was initially to issue recommendations. But this is a process of collective co-creation at the end of the day. So you listen, international opinions, and I remember that the first thing that we did was draw the minutes of what had been said to, structure in a document everything that had been done. And then we submitted this document to one of the political parties we were working with for the recommendations. And he told us, what's this crap? What's this crappy document you've shown us? There's no recommendation here whatsoever. And we told this person, first we need to make sure that we understand what has been said, what the ideas are. Then we need to start building from here. And we need to take it from here, because if I come here with our homework done, this won't work. There needs to be a process. In my opinion, you're there to listen first, to assimilate, to understand, other people's views, to do an exercise of empathy, and then propose alternatives that can be attractive and acceptable to all. But at the end, it is for them to decide, with our collaboration, of course. But the approach is different. I prefer the word facilitation. We are facilitating this process. I believe that the social forum, what Vaca Idea have done is, at the end of the day, social innovation. Social innovation to address unanswered challenges. And regarding the future and the challenges ahead, well, I decided to step back a bit, to step out of the process. And in my opinion, there are two principles worth mentioning when, reflecting on what's to come. Whatever happens, this process will never be perfect. It will always be flawed. Why? Well, because my expectations and Agu's expectations are different. So there won't be a process or a result that will be 100% satisfactory to each of us. There will always be some, elements on the wish list. And this is something that we need to acknowledge. Nothing will be perfect. What matters is that we continue making progress in order to leave to future generations the situation in a more structured and orderly fashion. And the second principle that I like to refer to has to do with the campaign that El Carri launched with Tapies in Saramago. I don't know if you can remember this campaign, which was endless hope. I'm quoting writer Saramago here. We need to make sure that we always feel hope. We've been in much worse situations, but we've never lost hope. We've been able to find a solution, and now that the conditions are, well, much, much better, I have an endless hope, and I truly believe that we will find solutions that won't satisfy us at 100%, but that will be good enough. Is that nice? Well, I don't know if I understood your question, but I'll do my best to answer. I believe that in the case of the Northern Basque Country, we've reached consensus. First of all, because we have sat around the table. Well, people with, different backgrounds, different ideas have sat around the table. And of course, we had the temptation of, thinking on the short term. After Ayete, everybody expected a negotiation. This didn't happen. And of course, there's always a short-term interest, but we were able to respect the pace, the timing factor, and we were able to respect the time that others needed. In our case, this was one of the keys to success. And this was one of the keys to build an environment of trust. It's true that there wasn't a climate of trust in the Northern Basque Country, although the environment was very different to the one here. It's true that many political risks were assumed then, both here and in the Northern Basque Country. We're voting for people and not political parties, and there were many political representatives that took on significant risks. This is one of my key learnings regarding what worked, why, and how important it is to generate trust. When you share your views, depending on what I share, you can contribute to more or less trust. And I believe that we were able to build trust. In the Northern Basque Country, we've always spoken up, always spoken openly, and this helped to contribute. This helped to create a climate of trust. And from the other side of the border, you sometimes look at us, open-eyed, surprised with what we've been able to accomplish. And I believe we are reaching the end of a stage, both in the northern and in the southern Basque Country, and the time has come for us to start a new phase. And I think it's high time to start with this new stage, sharing, doing a diagnosis of where we stand, of what the situation is, and this will help us start taking steps. But before we start taking steps and before we get the ball rolling, we need to identify what's pending, what needs to be done. And I think we need to put an end to exceptional legislation. We need to put an end to all those exceptional measures. And not only to make sure that the prisoners and fugitives can come back home. This is an obstacle for the future. This is a shared challenge at both sides of the border. Of course, we need to address the issue of victims. And there's still much work to be done regarding these two issues. We've still have a long winding road ahead to bring together positions to seek for common solutions that we can agree on. And I think that we can leverage ourselves on what we have learned already in this journey, in this social forum. I think that we can now address these issues from a different perspective, and we can untangle these knots. We can overcome this deadlock. Of course, there are people that work in politics and that manipulate. And I have to acknowledge that when the international collaboration group was dissolved, I felt a bit of panic. I thought, oh my goodness, this is the end of the group. But the fact that it's being closed means that we have closed a stage. The social forum ends, but what's to come is good, is positive. And whenever this kind of decisions are made, well, of course, these decisions have been, given much thought to. And if they are made, it's because we need to prompt or generate something new to secure change. And now what we need to do is readjust and enter a new stage, a new phase, a phase in which we will have to be creative. How do we weave consensus? Well, by creating or generating trust. We've done facilitation in different spaces. During the first stages of the forum, we were listened to with the eyes but not with the ears, and the forum was labeled from the very beginning. It was hard for us to overcome this label. Now we enjoy a good, interlocution with the different stakeholders. We need to build trust. That comes first. And second, this idea of the 5%. I want to expand much further. This helps us move towards what I call the ladder strategy. For example, in the case of prisoners, the first spaces allow for, agreements for ill prisoners. We have been issuing joint statements with trade unions. We've been working hard and to put an end to what we call dispersion. So bring the prisoners closer. The institutions, the trade unions are still working hard to build a consensus. And we need to put an end to the traditional penitentiary policy. And this new stage will require new elements. This is something that we will understand little by little. And everybody needs to feel part and parcel, and everybody needs to feel, engaged in the process. Paul has explained this very clearly earlier. There are pending challenges. Day before yesterday, I was in Barcelona, and when I talked about, those pending things, somebody asked me, well, why are you, saying goodbye? Why are you dissolving the social forum? Well, after the 12 recommendations of the forum, we believe that we need to bring this project to an end. In 2018, with the dissolution of ETA and with Sanchez coming to power, we started with a phase titled Victims, Prisoners, and Memory. In the case of victims, we have been able to address the issue of welcomes, or the so-called ongi etorris, that has an impact not only on prisoners but also on victims. Up until now, when we thought about victims, we thought, some victims are more victims than others. Ongi etorris, these welcomes, were very painful for some victims. But now, the approach is different. The Basque and the Navarre governments have understood that it's very important to leave behind that asymmetrical treatment of victims. You in Navarre have tabled the BAC report that has been welcomed by the trade unions and by the political parties. Of course, there's still a lot to do. Still very rough around the edges. First, we need to give greater visibility to the reparation of victims. We need to give visibility to their recognition. We need to repair their harm. We need to acknowledge victims institutionally. And second, this is also very important, we need to change our mindset, our attitude. If you go out on the street and ask people about victims, they think about ETA victims and perhaps not so much state victims. It's true that things are changing. In the 60s and in the 70s, ETA victims felt socially marginalized or isolated. And now the situation has changed. It's very important that the institutions take action. It's very important that we understand the need to recognize all kinds of victims. And as regards prisoners who have fled from justice or deported, there is a lobby in the Spanish state made up of the Guardia Civil, the Civil Guard, judges and prosecutors of the Spanish National High Court, Association of the Victims of Terrorism, and a series of far-right media outlets who have wanted to hinder this process and to prevent victims from being recognized. Some of the victims that have been empowered, that are speaking up on the social media, are being attacked. Maixabel Laza, Landaburu, Iñaki Garcia, Arichabalaga. Just because they are speaking up and conveying a narrative that's different to the majority opinion of the Victims Association, are being attacked. We are breaking this glass ceiling, but we need to continue working. We need to continue pushing, and this battle of narratives is progressing. Yesterday, I was in the Basque country, and they also, and the Basque government, and they also believe that we need to change the approach. It's true that now we're in the pre-elections period. Now perhaps it's not the best time to implement change, but we need to nurture the process. And aside from the contributions of the social forum, I'd like to underscore the Giralak report drafted by Laza, among others, a series of historians. And they say something that may seem simple, but that nobody was bold enough to state. They said, we will never reach an agreement regarding what happened, but we need to reach an agreement regarding the future. We are, entangled in these conversations, endless conversations on why this happened. And we also need to reflect on access to truth. Both the victims of the state, the Spanish state, and the victims of ETA want to have access to truth and justice. In a process without transitional justice, we need to ensure access to truth. We're witnessing the lobbying to reopen some cases. This affects 30-ish, 40, or around 40%, 40 people. And we need to ensure that there are mechanisms in place so that victims have access to the right to truth. There is no transitional justice. This is clear to all of us, and we need to find new paths towards transitional justice. As Paul was saying earlier, the end result will never satisfy us 100%. There will always be, some degrees of insatisfaction, but we need to make sure that that insatisfaction is as small as possible so that we can continue progressing. Because, as Anais was saying, we don't want to leave to our grandchildren the responsibility that we've had with the Civil War. And my place at home, my mom, my dad never talked about Civil War. And we cannot leave this responsibility to our grandchildren. It is us, our generation, who needs to address this very thorny issue. And it's no easy task. Thanks very much. Indeed. Well, we are, closing a door, but this doesn't mean that our work ends here. No, not at all. We will have to continue working together. And of course, we will have to bring on board many more people in this process. We're very grateful to each and every one of you for your contribution.